Okay, so moving on into the next lecture in Rudolf Steiner's commentary to the Gospel of Matthew. In this chapter, he discusses some of the number symbolisms that are necessary and why there are different numbers of generations given in both the genealogy of the Matthew Gospel and in the Luke Gospel. The Luke Gospel gives 77 generations, but it traces the descent of Christ backwards through Joseph all the way back to Adam, whereas the genealogy in Matthew traces it through, as we've seen, 42 generations total. So there are reasons why these numbers are different. So Steiner goes into the esoteric symbolism of the significance of the two numbers. And in both cases, what the ultimate spiritual number should be is 7 times 7 equals 49 in the case of Matthew, and 12 times 7, which would be not 77, which is 11 times 7, but 84, which is actually twice 42. It's interesting, these numbers too, that Steiner eschewed Western astrology because 7 is the key number for Saturn. Saturn makes 90-degree transits every 7 years, and you cross a threshold that's very difficult every 7 years in your life, which corresponds very nicely with Steiner's model about how the individual goes through a different form of the subtle body every 7 years. And 84 has to do with the length of a Uranus cycle. Uranus takes 84 years to go around the sun, and at 42, and it's always associated with breakthroughs or destabilizations depending on the energy at 42 and at 84. Be that as it may, nonetheless, so Steiner talks now about the Essenes, and he says that this character that he mentioned, this obscure character amongst them last time, Jesus ben Pandira, who was stoned and hung from a tree, was responsible for teaching the Essenes the symbolism of the fact that, as Steiner begins the chapter saying, that it takes 42 generations for a degree of impurity to be sort of filtered out of the generations. In other words, heredity is active over 42 generations. I'm not sure this would agree with genetics, but this is the world of esoterics, of occult science. It's a different world. It says that it takes 42 generations in which to prepare a pure physical body, physical and etheric actually, a physical body for an exalted being, like in this case with the Solomon boy, it's going to be the incarnation of Zarathustra. And eventually, of course, it'll be the incarnation of the Christ being after the two boys are combined. The Essenes would have known this, that it takes 42 generations, and you get to these 42 generations, and they've gone chronologically through time, and then by the time you get to that last generation, you get the descent of Zarathustra, the Zarathustra ego, reincarnating into the Solomon boy, whose chronology is in Matthew. And that the latter 7, which would complete a perfect cycle of 7 times 7, has to do with the ascent then, or in this case, the descent of the spiritual into the physical. It has to do with the final phase of 7. So the final phase always brings you to the cusp of the spiritual, and the 43rd generation with the descent of Zarathustra then begins this process that's already been cleansed. The physical body and the etheric body have already been cleansed of any kind of hereditary influences and is now a kind of pure vessel. And the Essenes would then have had to ascend through a series of 42 stages of initiation in whatever their mysteries were. Steiner doesn't say what the 42 stages are, just that Jesus ben Pandira would have told them about the necessity for undergoing very strict monastic rituals and initiations into 42 distinct stages in order for them, as it were, to have a clear, clairvoyant perception into the spiritual realm, whereby the being who descended, as we have seen from the Son initiate, passed on to Abraham through Melchizedek, entered into Abraham. So they want to get to that point before he entered into them and then became the kind of folk soul of the Hebrews that took 42 generations to process. So that's the ultimate goal of the Essenes processes of initiations, through these 42 stages. And so Steiner says then, now the reason for, so we've got, man is of twofold nature. He's got the 4 bodies, but the ones that he is inhabiting during his relation to the outer world is the physical body and the etheric body, which organizes it. And while he is awake, he's of course using both the ego and the astral body. But when he's asleep, it's a little different because the astral body and the ego leave the physical and etheric behind, and this is the twofold nature. We have the two upper bodies of ego and astral, the two lower bodies of physical and etheric, and cosmic forces then stream into the physical and etheric during sleep to repair that body. But once you go to sleep, the astral body sort of ascends and sort of dissipates into the cosmos, where other forces such as the sound ether, as we have heard, and the life ether work on it. So there are these two aspects, and the perfecting of the physical and etheric body for the reincarnation of Zarathustra has been accomplished through these 42 generations. So that side of man has been prepared for this being, but now we have to have another boy, according to Steiner. This is the Nathan Jesus, whose genealogy is traced in the Luke Gospel. His descent over 77 generations has to be traced in that gospel now as regards the astral and the ego. And so the Essenes would have been able to sort of, when you wake up and you don't sort of consciously enter into your physical and etheric body so that you can see what the forces going on inside them are. These would be like proprioceptions, where you have the ability to perceive what's going on inside of you, because as soon as you wake up, your attention is automatically diverted through your senses to the outer world. But during the kind of spiritual practices that the Essenes would have developed, they would have been able to see these processes in their physical and etheric bodies consciously, to enter down into them, not just be attuned to the outer world, but to enter into them in a kind of yogic process. And then also, with respect to the other side of this initiation, when you go to sleep, you ascend in the astral and the ego into the outer world. The Essenes would have been able to do this through a process of ascent through their initiations to enter into this sort of while awake, so that they use the astral and the ego as a sort of vehicle for spiritual perception of these worlds. And Steiner says there are dangers on both parts of this with respect to descending into the physical body and the etheric body sort of while awake. You can fall prey to the temptations of the physical body, the desires and passions, things that can cause you to be taken away. With regard to the dangers of entering while conscious into the spiritual worlds, the danger there is that you're sort of blinded by the grandeur of it, by the spiritual radiance of it. It's kind of an inflation, in other words, that is the danger there. So then Steiner says, so now doing both of these procedures, which we all do normally every day, while awake, in both cases then becomes a kind of initiation procedure for the Essenes to do this, so that in the one case they can perceive through the 42 generations the perfection of what will eventually be the physical body of the Solomon boy, and then the ascent with the astral and the ego aspect for the Nathan boy. And the reason we have the 77 generations of descent in the Luke Gospel for this is because Steiner says, now once there is an ascent into the outer world, we have the 12 signs of the zodiac, which create a kind of spiritual periphery, and we've got the 7 traditional planetary bodies. The sun and moon aren't planets, of course, but in the traditional world, they were thought of as planets. So you would have 12 times 7, which would give you 84. So there again, as in the case of the 42, which falls 7 shy of 49 for the physical and etheric, here too, in the genealogy of Luke, we have the 77, which is 7 short of the complete 84, because that's the entry, the final entry. The ascent into the spiritual world takes place in a kind of spiral fashion in the astral plane, a kind of spiral fashion of making 12 circuits of the zodiac, or making 7 circuits of the zodiac. So you go through those 12 signs 7 times, a kind of spiral. This a little bit imitates Steiner's idea that the plants have a spiral growth as plants grow. As Goethe, he got this from Goethe, said they grow in a spiral fashion because they're actually imitating the whirlings of the planets. So that there is a relationship between plants and planets. This is well known in biodynamic agriculture that Steiner founded. So these things have concrete effects to them. So 11 times 7, then you have the 77, and then the final 7 is the actual boundary at the threshold of the divine spiritual world that completes it to the 84 for the last 7. So in both cases, the missing 7 that would make 49 for the descent across the generations, and the missing 7 that would make the 84 for the descent in the Luke gospel have to do with the actual ascent into the spiritual world, because the spiritual being also has to descend toward man across, as the Essenes would realize in their initiations, they have to ascend through the 42, but the divine being also has to descend through those to man, through those 42 generations. And then the ascent into the astral, we have the 77, the sort of ladder, you might say, in Luke. You might think of it as a sort of, with Matthew, as a kind of horizontal ladder across time, across the generations. And even though it is a genealogy in Luke, in a way it's a kind of ascent, descent, vertical axis of ascent up into the spiritual world, and the descent of what will be the Nathan boy and his astral body and ego have to be prepared, just as for the Solomon boy, his physical body and ether body have to be prepared. So both have to be prepared, hence the necessity. This is Steiner's very complicated explanation for the necessity of why there should be 2 Jesus children, and I'm still not 100% convinced that we need to have 2 Jesus children, but I am impressed how he thinks all this shit out. I mean, it's pretty amazing how it all works out. And so he says this is why we have 2 different genealogies with these different numbers. And I'm absolutely certain that he is correct, at least about that much, that the authors of these Gospels chose these numbers for an esoteric reason, because they're all keyed in with 7. And 7 is a primary mystical number. So then that's it for this chapter. Steiner's spending a lot of, we're already at coming up on lecture 6 here, and we're still just at the genealogy of Matthew. So we'll see how far he actually makes it into the Matthew Gospel here.